The restaurant smelled like money, not the honest kind. Not the warm scent of bread baking in a home kitchen or coffee brewed in a chipped mug. This was the smell of wealth that had never needed to justify itself. Aged leather, imported candles with names I couldn't pronounce, and something floral that probably cost more per bottle than my monthly rent. I had learned, in the 8 months I'd worked at Rosario's, to breathe through my mouth during the first hour of every shift. It helped me remember that this place wasn't mine, that I was passing through it, invisible, like a ghost who carried plates. Table 7 needs water, Claire. My manager, David, said my name the way someone says obstacle, clipped. Impatient. As if my existence was an inconvenience he tolerated only because I showed up on time and never broke anything expensive. I nodded without looking at him, lifted the crystal pitcher from the service station, and moved. The dining room of Rosario's existed in a permanent state of curated twilight. Warm amber light pooled over white tablecloths. Candles flickered inside glass domes. The walls were dark wood paneled so smoothly they looked like liquid. Every table was spaced far enough apart to suggest that the conversations happening within them were never meant to be overheard. And they weren't. The clientele of Rosario's understood discretion the way they understood wine pairings, as a fundamental requirement, not an optional courtesy. I moved between tables with the particular kind of efficiency that comes from exhaustion. My feet had stopped hurting 3 hours ago, which meant the nerves had simply given up sending distress signals. My hair, dark and pulled tight at the nape of my neck, had started to escape in small rebellious strands near my temples. I didn't have a free hand to fix it. I kept moving. Table 7 was near the back, a foretop that had been reserved under a name I didn't recognize, which wasn't unusual. Half the reservations at Rosario's came under names that weren't real, or under corporate accounts that existed only on paper. The maitre d' had learned not to ask. I had learned the same lesson for different reasons. I rounded the partition that separated the main dining room from the private alcoves and stopped. Not dramatically. Not the way people stop in films with a sharp intake of breath and wide eyes. I stopped the way a person stops when the ground shifts slightly beneath them. A small, involuntary pause while the body recalibrates. There were 4 men at the table. 3 of them I processed peripherally. Dark suits, careful posture. The particular stillness of men who had trained themselves never to look relaxed in public. They sat with their backs to walls or angles that gave them sightlines to both entrances. One had a phone face down on the table beside his right hand. Another had said nothing since I'd approached, but had already, I realized, tracked my movement from the moment I'd cleared the partition. The 4th man was looking at the menu. He was younger than I expected, younger than the gravity of the table seemed to require. Late 20s, perhaps 30. With dark hair that fell in a controlled wave across his forehead. His jaw was the kind that painters used to use as reference, sharp, clean, with a faint shadow of stubble that looked less like negligence and more like a deliberate choice. His suit was charcoal, perfectly fitted in a way that had nothing to do with off-the-rack tailoring. A single watch at his left wrist caught the candlelight, no other jewelry, no ostentation, as if he understood that the most expensive things rarely needed to announce themselves. He hadn't looked up. "Good evening," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I deserved credit for. "My name is Claire. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with still or sparkling water?" 3 heads turned toward me with the automatic courtesy of men accustomed to service. The 4th did not move. Then, slowly, he lowered the menu. His eyes were dark, the kind of dark that isn't simply brown but carries depth, like looking into water and being unable to gauge how far down it goes. They moved to me with a quality I had no immediate word for. Not assessment, exactly. Not interest in the conventional sense. Something more patient than either of those things. Something that suggested he had already decided what he thought and was simply confirming it. "Still," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The single word occupied the space around our table and then disappeared, and I found myself nodding as if I'd been given a full instruction. I poured the water. I didn't spill anything. I was almost proud of myself. "I'll give you a few more minutes with the menu," I managed, and retreated. The rest of the first hour passed in the ordinary rhythm of a busy Friday service. I took orders at 3 other tables. I delivered an amuse-bouche to a couple celebrating an anniversary they seemed to have forgotten to be happy about. I refilled bread baskets and recited the evening's specials with the practiced warmth of someone who had memorized enthusiasm without feeling it. But I was aware of table 7 the way you're aware of a sound you can't quite identify. Not frightening, not loud, simply present in a way that ordinary sounds aren't. He spoke rarely. When he did, the other 3 men listened with their whole bodies, the slight forward lean of people receiving important information. He cut his food with precision. He didn't check his phone. At one point, a man I hadn't seen before, older, thick-necked, with the look of someone who spent his days being useful in unspecified ways, appeared at the edge of the alcove. He waited. The man at the table didn't turn to look at him. He simply held up 2 fingers, and the thick-necked man nodded and disappeared. It was the smallest gesture I had ever seen accomplish so much. I told myself to stop watching. I went to the service station to prepare the dessert tray for table 11, and I was carefully not thinking about dark eyes and low voices when Marco, the busboy, clipped my elbow with a full tray of glassware. It happened fast, the way accidents always do. One moment I was holding a small ceramic ramekin of creme brulee, and the next the tray tilted. My balance shifted, and I was moving sideways with the specific helpless momentum of someone who already knows they're going to fall and is merely waiting for the impact. I didn't fall. A hand caught my arm, not Marco's, because Marco had gone very still and pale in a way that told me immediately he was looking at something behind me, and the grip was firm enough to stop my momentum completely, but careful enough not to bruise. I was pulled upright in a single smooth motion, and when I turned, the creme brulee still somehow in my hand, I was standing close enough to smell cedar, and something darker beneath it, like smoke from a fire that had burned a very long time ago. He was looking at me with those patient, unreadable eyes. "Careful," he said. One word. The same unhurried quality as before. But up close, with his hand still at my arm and the candlelight doing complicated things to the angles of his face, the word landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "I'm so sorry, I'm fine, thank you, You're fine," he agreed. And there was something in his tone that wasn't quite amusement, and wasn't quite warmth, but existed in the space between them. His hand left my arm. The absence of it was a physical thing. He returned to his table. I stood at the service station for a moment longer than I should have, the ramekin cold in my palm, and reminded myself firmly that I had 3 other tables and a dessert order to deliver, and absolutely no reason to feel as though the room had rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. Then I looked down. In the small professional chaos of the almost fall, the button at my collar, the top one, the one I always fastened because David had a policy about professional presentation, had come undone. It must have caught on something. The gap it left was modest by any reasonable standard, a small triangle of skin at the base of my throat. Nothing scandalous, but as I reached up to refasten it, I glanced toward the back alcove. He was already looking at the menu again. Except that he hadn't ordered dessert. And the menu at Rosario's didn't have a dessert section. My fingers fumbled on the button. He wasn't reading it, I realized. He was giving me somewhere to look that wasn't at him. The ceramic ramekin was very cold in my hand. The dining room suddenly felt smaller than it had a moment ago, the amber light a degree warmer. The distance between the service station and that back table somehow shorter than the floor plan suggested it should be. I fastened the button. I delivered the dessert. I did not look at table 7 again for the rest of the night, but when I finally cleared the alcove at the end of service and found, beneath the water glass, a card, matte black, no logo, just a phone number in silver ink, I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself that twice more on the train ride home. By the time I reached my apartment, the card was still in my apron pocket, and I had stopped telling myself anything at all. I didn't call the number. This was a decision I made approximately 40 times over the following 3 days, which suggested it wasn't really a decision at all, but rather an ongoing negotiation with myself that I kept winning by increasingly narrow margins. The card lived in the small ceramic dish on my kitchen counter, where I kept spare change and forgotten receipts. I moved it twice, once to the drawer beside the sink, once back to the dish, as if geography would resolve what logic couldn't. It was a phone number on a black card. That was all. People left cards at restaurants for any number of reasons. He was probably a businessman. A wealthy, absurdly handsome businessman with security personnel and a watch that cost more than my car, who caught falling waitresses with the reflexes of someone who had practiced catching things before they broke. I went to work. I served tables. I came home and ate whatever required the fewest dishes, and slept the shallow, unrestful sleep of someone who had been on their feet for 9 hours. On the 4th day, my landlord called about the heat. More precisely, he called to inform me that the boiler serving my floor of the building had failed, that the repair would take between 1 and 2 weeks, and that he was deeply sorry for the inconvenience in the tone of a man who had never been inconvenienced by anything in his life. November in the city was not a month that tolerated a failed boiler with any grace. By the 2nd night, I was sleeping in 2 sweaters and had begun to view my breath condensing in the air above my bed as a personal accusation. I told myself the cold had nothing to do with why I looked at the card again that 5th morning. I told myself that 4 more times. Then I took a photo of the number, put the card back in the dish, and went to work. Friday service was heavier than usual. A private event in the back room had pulled David's attention completely, which meant the rest of us were managing the main floor with the particular controlled chaos of people pretending everything was fine. I moved fast, kept my head down, and was in the middle of reciting the evening's pasta special to a table of 4 when I felt it, that shift in the room's atmosphere, the way a barometric pressure changes before weather arrives. I didn't look up immediately. I finished the special. I took the order. I smiled at the appropriate moments. Then I looked toward the entrance. He was already inside. The maitre d' was leading him, not toward the back alcove this time, but toward a 2-top near the window, a table reserved for people who wanted to be seen without appearing to want it. He had only one man with him tonight, broad-shouldered and quiet, who took a seat at the small bar adjacent with the practiced ease of someone who had done this exact thing in exactly this kind of room many times before. He sat. He didn't look around the room. He unfolded the napkin across his lap with the same economy of motion he seemed to apply to everything, and he opened the menu. David materialized at my elbow. "Table 3 is yours," he said. And then, before I could respond, "Don't be awkward about it, Claire." I wanted to ask how he expected me to define awkward given the circumstances. I didn't. I picked up my notepad and walked to table 3. He looked up when I was still 2 steps away. Not when I arrived. Not when I spoke. 2 steps away, as if some perimeter had been crossed that I hadn't known existed. "Claire," he said. My name in his mouth was a completely different object than it was anywhere else. I didn't know how to account for that. "Good evening," I said, and I was proud again of my voice, of the professional steadiness I had apparently constructed out of nothing. "Welcome back. Can I start you with water?" "You didn't call," he said. Not accusatory. Not wounded. It was an observation, delivered with the same calm that seemed to be his natural climate. The way some people are simply always warm, or always running slightly cool. He was watching me with those deep, patient eyes, and I had the sudden, disorienting sense that he had a great deal of practice waiting for things. "I don't make a habit of calling numbers left by strangers," I said carefully. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. The outline. "Dante Rossi," he said. "Now we're not strangers." I wrote nothing on my notepad. "Still water, Mr. Rossi?" "Dante." He said it without pressure, simply a correction. And yes, I poured the water. My hand was steady. I was deeply grateful for this. He ordered without consulting the menu again. The branzino, vegetables on the side, a specific white wine that our sommelier produced from the back of the cellar with an expression of pleased surprise. I delivered everything with the efficiency I had trained myself to perform, and I told myself with each visit to the table that I was simply doing my job, that he was simply a customer, that the way he tracked my movement through the dining room without appearing to watch was something I was imagining. I was not imagining it. I caught it by accident near the end of his meal, when I was clearing a table 2 away and happened to glance in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. He wasn't looking at me then. He was looking at a man across the room, a heavy-set diner in his 50s who had been there since before Dante arrived. There was nothing overt in Dante's expression, nothing threatening in any way I could have pointed to and named, but the man across the room shifted in his seat, signaled for his check, and left 11 minutes earlier than the pattern of his meal suggested he'd planned to. I brought Dante's check without being asked. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at it, then at me, with an expression I couldn't fully decode. "You're working too hard," he said. The observation landed oddly, the way unexpected kindness sometimes does. Sideways, finding gaps I hadn't known were open. "It's my job," I said. "I know what it is." He paused. "I'm asking about you." I didn't have an answer for that. I was fairly certain no one had asked me a version of that question in longer than I wanted to calculate. The honesty of that realization was briefly mortifying. "I'm fine," I said, which was what I always said. And he looked at me the way people look at something they've already seen through. He left the check with a tip that made me check the numbers twice, assuming I'd misread them. I hadn't. There was nothing else. No card this time, no note. Just the money and the particular quality of absence that a space has after someone compelling has left it. He came back the following Friday. And the one after that. By the third consecutive week, David had stopped assigning me to table 3 and simply expected me to take it, the way you stop explaining a routine once it's become one. The other waitstaff said nothing directly, but I intercepted glances, the kind that mean, "What do you know that we don't?" And I had no answer for them either. Dante Rossi came to Rosario's every Friday at 8. He ordered the same wine. He ate well, spoke rarely to his companion at the bar, and spent considerable portions of his meals talking to me in the quiet, unhurried way that gradually stopped feeling like conversation and started feeling like something with more weight to it. Something I didn't have precise language for, but that I thought about on the train home and in the cold of my still broken heated apartment, and in the narrow corridor between sleep and waking. He asked questions, not intrusive ones, nothing about my past or my family or the specific details of my life that I kept organized in careful compartments. He asked what I thought about things, whether I'd read a book he mentioned, what I'd order if I were the one sitting at the table. Small questions, but asked with a quality of attention that made them feel significant, as if my answers were being stored somewhere and considered. I started answering honestly. This frightened me slightly. On the 4th Friday, near the end of service, a man arrived at the restaurant who had not made a reservation. He was well dressed enough to pass a brief inspection, but there was something about his energy. Too fast, too bright, the particular vibration of someone running on adrenaline and poor decisions. That made the maitre d' hesitate. He didn't hesitate long enough. The man moved through the dining room with directional certainty, heading toward table 3, and I was in his path when I realized it. I had a full tray, 4 plates, a bread basket, 2 glasses of wine. I stopped. "Where is he?" the man said, and his voice was wrong in a way I registered before I could identify why. "Too loud for this room. Too careless." "I'm sorry. I don't know who you—" "Don't." He stepped closer. I held the tray. "Tell him Marco Vieri is here and that I want what's mine." I was aware in my peripheral vision of Dante's companion rising from the bar stool with a calm that matched the gravity of the movement. I was more acutely aware of Dante himself, who had turned in his chair, not sharply, not with alarm, but with the slow deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to arrive and is now simply acknowledging that it has. His eyes moved from the man to me. And the expression in them, for the first time since I'd met him, was not patient. It was not calm. It was something contained and controlled and very, very cold, the way deep water is cold not from neglect, but from depth. He said something to his companion in a voice too low to hear. The companion nodded and moved toward the man, who had already begun to look as though he'd made a miscalculation. Dante stood. He was taller than the room seemed to account for when he was seated. He straightened his jacket with one smooth motion and looked at me. Only at me, as if the other man had already ceased to be a variable worth tracking. "Go to the kitchen, Claire," he said quietly. Not a suggestion, not a request. The gentlest possible version of an order. I went. I was halfway through the kitchen door when I heard the dining room go completely, unnaturally quiet behind me. I did not look back. But my hands, when I finally set the tray down on the steel counter inside, were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the weight of it. Nobody told me what happened to Marco Vieri. This was, I understood, intentional. David pulled me aside the following morning with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information he'd been specifically instructed to deliver in a specific way. He told me that Friday's incident had been resolved, that the gentleman involved had been escorted from the premises, and that Rosario's valued my professionalism during a difficult moment. He said all of this while looking slightly to the left of my face, which told me the script had been written by someone else, and that David was simply reading it. Resolved, I repeated. Completely, he said, with the conviction of someone who had decided not to ask follow-up questions. I nodded and went back to work, but the word stayed with me, resolved. With its clean, bureaucratic finality, the way a door closing sounds different depending on who's on the other side of it. I thought about the dining room going silent, about Dante rising from his chair, about the quality of cold I'd seen move across his face, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but from something older and more settled than anger, something that has had years to calcify into absolute certainty about what it will and will not permit. I told myself it was none of my business. I believed this less each time I said it. He came the following Friday. I had spent the week telling myself I didn't know whether he would, which was dishonest in the specific way that only self-deception can be. I knew he would come. I had known it with the same quiet certainty that I knew the November cold would persist, and that my landlord would continue to be deeply sorry for the inconvenience without actually fixing anything. He arrived at 8, precisely as always. One companion at the bar, the same table, the same wine. I brought the water without being asked. He watched me pour it, and when I set the pitcher down, he said, "You're not going to ask." Ask what? About Friday. I met his eyes. It didn't seem like something you'd want me to ask about. Something in his expression shifted. Not much, the way tectonic things shift. Imperceptibly at the surface, significantly beneath. Most people ask anyway, he said. I'm not most people, I said, and immediately felt self-conscious about how that sounded, but he received it with a small nod, as if it had confirmed something rather than surprised him. No, he agreed. You're not. He was quiet for a moment, turning the wine glass slightly on the tablecloth with 2 fingers. A rare instance of something that looked almost like restlessness. Then, "Are you all right? After Friday?" The question was simple. His eyes were not. They were doing that thing again, that deep, measuring attention. But there was something underneath the measurement now, something I hadn't seen in the previous weeks, something that looked, if I was willing to follow the observation to its honest conclusion, very much like concern. "I'm fine," I started, and then stopped, because he was looking at me with the same expression he'd worn the first time I'd said those words, and I remembered that he'd already seen through them once. The shaking stopped after about 10 minutes. I admitted, "I'm fine now." He held my gaze. "It shouldn't have happened near you. You couldn't have predicted. I predict everything," he said. And it wasn't arrogance, just a statement of professional fact, the way a surgeon might say I wash my hands. I didn't account for how quickly he'd move through the room. That won't happen again. The architecture of that sentence, that won't happen again, as if my proximity to disruption was a logistical problem he had taken personal responsibility for, settled over me in a way I didn't entirely know how to receive. "You don't need to protect me," I said carefully. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." The boiler in my building was fixed 3 weeks later, not by the landlord, but by a crew of technicians who arrived on a Tuesday morning with equipment and efficiency that seemed disproportionate to a residential repair job. My neighbor, Mrs. Alcott from 4B, told me through the hallway that the building management had apparently received some kind of pressure from a corporate property group that held a stake in the building. "Fancy lawyers," she said, with the satisfied air of someone who believed in fancy lawyers as a universal solution. Said the living conditions were substandard, fixed it in a day. I stood in my doorway and thought about the only person I'd mentioned the coal department to in recent memory. I didn't call him about it. Instead, the next Friday, I waited until he'd ordered, and then I said, "The boiler was fixed." He looked up from the menu, His expression was entirely neutral. "Good," he said. "Dante." He set the menu down, gave me his full attention. "Did you do that?" A pause, brief but present. "The building had code violations," he said. "That's not what I asked." He considered me for a moment. "No," he said finally, "it's not." And then, with a directness that I was learning was simply how he inhabited the world. "You were cold. It bothered me." 3 words. It bothered me. Delivered with the same quiet economy as everything else he said, as if caring about someone's comfort was an observable fact rather than a vulnerability. I didn't know what to do with that. I thanked him. I went back to the service station. I stood there for a moment with my notepad pressed against my chest, like something I needed to keep from escaping. It was a Saturday afternoon, 5 weeks after the incident with Marco Vieri, when I first saw the outside world through the lens of what Dante represented. I was at the market 2 blocks from my apartment, the crowded indoor one, with the narrow aisles and the vendor who always gave me an extra portion of olives because I'd once told him they reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen. I had a cloth bag over one arm and was comparing 2 nearly identical bunches of parsley when I became aware of a man watching me. He was positioned near the far end of the aisle, pretending to examine a display of canned goods with the elaborate nonchalance of someone who had never actually been interested in canned goods in his life. Mid-40s. Unremarkable in every deliberate way. The kind of deliberate that you don't notice unless you've started paying attention to the difference between someone who blends in naturally and someone who has worked at it. I put the parsley down. I moved to the next stall. He followed at a distance that was just outside the range that would feel threatening. My heart was doing something unpleasant. I left the market without the rest of my groceries, walked 2 blocks in the wrong direction, then doubled back and took a different route home. By the time I reached my building, he was gone. Or at least no longer visible, which I was beginning to understand were not the same thing. I sat on my kitchen floor for a little while, back against the cabinet, cloth bag with its half-purchased groceries in my lap. My grandmother's olives wrapped in paper. Parsley I hadn't bought. Then I took out my phone and looked at the number I'd photographed 5 weeks ago. I typed, "I think someone was following me today." The response came in under 2 minutes. "Are you home?" I stared at the screen. "Yes. Stay there." 4 minutes later, my intercom buzzed. The man who appeared when I opened my apartment door wasn't Dante. It was his broad-shouldered companion from the bar, whose name I learned in that moment was Leon, and who handed me a phone with the calm of someone delivering a perfectly routine object. Dante's voice on the other end was the same as always, low, unhurried. But underneath the surface of it, pulled tight like wire beneath fabric, was something I hadn't heard there before. "Describe him," he said. "Everything you remember." I described him. Dante listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence that had texture to it, dense, processing. "You did the right thing leaving," he said. "Who is he?" Another pause. Someone with poor judgment about what belongs to him and what doesn't. His voice had that quality again, the cold depth, the calcified certainty. "He won't approach you again." Dante. Claire. My name, the way he said it, had weight, gravity. "I need you to trust me right now." I looked around my small kitchen, the ceramic dish with the spare change and the black card I'd never thrown away, the window with its view of the gray November street, Leon, standing at a respectful distance in my hallway with the patient stillness of a man who was very good at his job. The honest answer was that I had already been trusting him, incrementally, in ways I hadn't formally acknowledged. That the trust had been building the way winter builds, gradually, then undeniably, until you look up one day, and everything has changed without a single dramatic moment to mark the transition. "Yes," I said. The exhale on his end was quiet, almost inaudible, but it was there. "Good," he said. "Leon will stay tonight. I'll explain everything tomorrow." I wanted to say I didn't need Leon to stay. I wanted to say I was fine, the way I always said I was fine, the words ready and automatic and entirely insufficient for what was actually happening inside my chest. "Okay," I said instead. We stayed on the line for another moment, neither of us speaking, just the quiet presence of an open connection. And then he said softly, "Lock the door, Claire." I locked the door. I leaned my forehead against it afterward, eyes closed, the phone still warm in my hand, and thought about a man who fixed broken boilers and sent protection without being asked, and used my name like it meant something specific to him. And I thought about how completely, quietly, thoroughly my life had become arranged around someone I still knew almost nothing about. The lock clicked solid beneath my hand. Outside, the city moved in its usual indifferent rhythms. Inside, I was beginning to understand that indifference was no longer something I had the option of returning to. He came the next morning at 10, not Friday, not the restaurant. My apartment. My small, imperfect apartment, with its second-hand furniture and the crack in the kitchen ceiling I'd stopped seeing, and the ceramic dish on the counter that still held his card. He knocked twice, unhurried, as if arriving at a woman's home on a Sunday morning was something he'd always done, and not something that had, until approximately 18 hours ago, been entirely outside the architecture of whatever we were to each other. I opened the door. He was in different clothes, the first time I'd seen him outside of the charcoal and navy of his restaurant appearances. Dark trousers, a cream shirt with the collar open. No jacket. The absence of the jacket did something unexpected. It made him look simultaneously more human and more dangerous. The way removing a frame from a painting doesn't diminish it, but changes what you're able to see. He looked at me for a moment, then at Leon, who had spent the night in my armchair with the philosophical acceptance of a man for whom this was a professional norm, and who stood now and gave a brief nod. "Anything?" Dante asked. "Quiet," Leon said, and let himself out. Dante looked back at me. "Coffee?" I said, because it was the only word my brain produced that seemed appropriately sized for the moment. "Please." He sat at my kitchen table, which was small and slightly uneven on one leg, and bore the ring stains of 100 previous mugs, with the same composure he brought to everything, as if the quality of one's furniture was entirely irrelevant information. I made the coffee with my back to him, and I was aware of his gaze the way you're aware of sunlight on your skin. Not intrusive, simply present, warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "The man from the market," he said, when I set the mug in front of him. "His name is Victor Hale. He works for a man who believes I owe him something I don't." I sat across from him. "Do you?" His eyes moved to mine. "No. But he thinks you do." "Men like that," he said carefully, wrapping both hands around the mug, "operate on a version of reality they've constructed to justify what they want. Victor was watching you to send a message. It wasn't about you." A pause, precise and weighted. "I need you to understand that it was entirely about me." I held his gaze. "Because of Fridays. Because you matter to me." He said it without decoration, without the hedging softness that people usually wrap around admissions of that weight. Just the words, placed on the table between us like something he'd decided to stop carrying alone. "Which means anyone paying attention to my patterns would notice you. I should have considered that sooner. I didn't. That's my failure. Not yours." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a pigeon landed on the window ledge, and then thought better of it. "How long has this been your life?" I asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Since I was 19, he said. "My father built something. I inherited it. I've spent 10 years making it more stable than he left it." He paused. "Stability, in my world, is relative." "What does that mean for the people near you?" His jaw tightened fractionally. "It means they require protection. It means I'm careful about who I allow near me, for their sake as much as mine." He looked at his coffee, then at me. "It means I don't do this." "This," I repeated, "sit in someone's kitchen on a Sunday morning and tell them the truth about my life." The corner of his mouth moved, not the suggestion of a smile this time. Something more complicated. "I haven't done this before." The admission landed quietly and stayed. "Why me?" I asked. It came out more honest than I intended, stripped of the deflection I usually kept ready. "I'm a waitress in a restaurant you could eat at in any city in the world. I'm no one particular." "Why, don't," he said. The word was gentle but absolute. He set his mug down and looked at me with an intensity that reorganized the air in the room. "You looked at me the first night," he said. the way people almost never do, not with recognition. Not, oh, it's him. Just as a person sitting at a table. You were tired and professional, and you didn't perform anything for me. Do you know how rarely that happens? I didn't answer. And then you caught yourself almost falling, he continued. And your first instinct was to apologize for the inconvenience to me. Something moved in his expression. Something that looked very much like it hurt. You've been apologizing for taking up space for a long time, Claire. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I don't know anything about you, he said. And I want to know everything. That hasn't happened to me before either. He stayed for 2 hours. We talked. Really talked. In the way that I had forgotten was possible, where words lead to other words and time stops being something you're managing and becomes something you're simply inside of. He told me about growing up in a family where loyalty was a currency more valuable than money, and where the line between protection and control had been blurred so long it had essentially ceased to exist. He told me about his father with the measured tone of someone who has processed grief through the filter of complicated inheritance. I told him about my grandmother's kitchen and the olives, and the way I'd come to the city with a specific plan for my life that had been dismantled so gradually I hadn't noticed until the pieces were already scattered. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without the restlessness of a person waiting for their turn to speak. At one point, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, typed 3 words, and put it face down. You can take that, I said. I know, he said, and didn't. When he finally stood to leave, the light in the kitchen had shifted from morning to early afternoon without my noticing. He put on his jacket, produced from somewhere, I hadn't seen where, and became incrementally more formal. The way people do when they're preparing to re-enter the world that requires something specific from them. At the door, he paused. I want to see you, he said, outside the restaurant, properly. He searched my face. If you're willing to understand what that means. What does it mean? It means you'll have Leon. It means there are things about my life I can tell you and things I can't, not yet. It means I'll be more careful than I've been. His voice dropped slightly. It means that when I say you're under my protection, it isn't negotiable. Not for me. The possessiveness of it should have alarmed me. I examined myself for alarm and found instead something that felt embarrassingly like relief. The particular relief of someone who has been managing alone for long enough that the offer of being looked after feels not like a cage, but like a door opening inward. That's a lot of conditions, I said. Yes, he agreed without apology. And if I said it was too much, he looked at me steadily, then I'd respect that. And I'd sit at table 3 every Friday until you changed your mind. I didn't say it was too much. What followed was unlike anything I had language for from my previous experience, because my previous experience had not prepared me for a man like Dante Rossi. He was not easy. Ease was not the point of him. He arrived in my life the way significant things arrive, not gently, not with warning, but with the weight of something that had always been moving toward you and has simply, finally, arrived. He took me to dinner at a restaurant so private it had no sign on the door. He sat with his back to the wall and watched the room with those careful eyes. And over the course of the meal, I began to understand that this vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was love expressed in the only language he'd been given. Keeping things safe, keeping people intact. He called every evening, not to fill silence, to ask specific questions, to hear my voice with the focused quality of someone taking inventory of something they value. I started to recognize his number before I looked at the screen, the way you recognize a particular kind of knock. Leon became a background presence in my life with the unobtrusive constancy of furniture I'd stopped noticing. He walked me to the market, waited outside my building when I worked evenings, communicated primarily through nods of varying degree. I brought him coffee once without being asked, and he looked at the cup as if I'd handed him something he didn't have a category for. You don't have to do that, he told me. I know, I said, and watched the corner of his mouth do something that was almost certainly a smile. It was on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks into Properly, that I understood the full weight of what Dante's possessiveness meant in practice. I was leaving Rosario's after a double shift, tired in that specific way where your thoughts run slightly behind your actions, when a car pulled alongside me on the sidewalk. Not threateningly, just present, pacing me, the window lowered. A man I didn't recognize leaned across from the passenger seat. "You're Dante Rossi's girl," he said. Not a question. Leon was behind me in 4 steps. His hand didn't touch the man. Didn't need to. He simply stood, and whatever quality he projected in that moment was sufficient. The car moved on, but the phrase stayed in me for the rest of the walk home, settling into places I hadn't examined yet. Dante Rossi's girl. Said by a stranger with the casual certainty of someone stating a known fact. I thought about what it meant to be identified that way. To have become, in the city's particular underground cartography, something that belonged to a specific man. I thought about whether I minded. I was still thinking about it when my phone rang. "You're home?" Dante said. Almost a pause. A man in a car knew who I was. The silence on his end had that quality again. The wire beneath fabric, pulled taut. "Gray sedan," he said. It wasn't a question either. "Yes. I know." Another pause, controlled and precise. "I'm sorry, Claire." "Don't be sorry," I said, surprising myself. I stopped. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me what I am to you," I said. "Not what I am to them, to you." The silence that followed was different from his operational ones. It was unguarded in a way I hadn't heard from him before. Open at the edges, uncertain in the way that only honest things are uncertain. "Everything I'm not supposed to want," he said finally. "Everything I should have been more careful about. Everything I'm not capable of giving up." I stood on my street with the cold November air against my face and the phone pressed to my ear. "Okay," I said softly. "Okay?" His voice was careful. "That's enough for tonight," I said. "That's enough." I heard him breathe. "Lock the door," he said. "I always do now," I told him. And somewhere in the space between those 2 sentences was the shape of everything we hadn't said yet, and everything we were going to have to face, and the particular fragile weight of a life that had rearranged itself completely around something I hadn't seen coming and couldn't imagine now living without. The call came on a Wednesday, not Dante's number, an unknown one, which I'd learned in the preceding weeks to treat with the particular caution of someone who has been educated, gradually and without formal instruction, in the grammar of danger. I almost didn't answer. Then I thought about Victor Hale and gray sedans, and the way threats in Dante's world rarely announce themselves with the courtesy of advance warning, and I picked up. "Miss Claire Voss." A man's voice, older, smooth in the way that expensive things sometimes hide sharp edges. "My name is Richard Hale. I believe you know my associate, Victor." My kitchen felt smaller immediately. I moved to the window without thinking. The instinct to see the street, to confirm the ordinary world was still outside. "What do you want?" I said. "A conversation, nothing dramatic, a pause constructed to sound reasonable. I want you to deliver a message to Dante Rossi. Tell him that what was agreed upon in March needs to be honored, or the consequences extend beyond professional inconvenience." Another pause. "Tell him I know where you have coffee on Tuesday mornings." The line went dead. My hands were steady. This surprised me. 3 months ago they would have shaken. Instead, I stood at my window, watching a woman walk a small dog along the pavement below, and I thought with cold clarity about Tuesday mornings, the cafe 2 blocks east, where I went before my afternoon shifts, where I sat by the window and read and existed in the uncomplicated pleasure of an hour that belonged entirely to me. Someone had been watching that hour, had catalogued it, had decided it was useful. I called Dante. He answered before the second ring. "Claire." "Richard Hale just called me," I said. He knew about Tuesday mornings. The silence that followed was the shortest and most absolute I'd ever heard from him. "Read me the number," he said. I read it. I heard him relay it in a low voice to someone in the room with him. Then, "Where are you right now?" "My apartment." "Stay there. Don't open the door for anyone except Leon. He stopped. When he spoke again, his voice had that controlled quality, but underneath it, running like a current beneath ice, was something I hadn't heard from him before. Something raw. "I'm coming myself." He arrived in 40 minutes. When I opened the door, He looked at me with an intensity that bypassed all the composed patience of his usual manner, and went straight to something more fundamental, his eyes moving over me in rapid assessment, not with desire, but with the specific focus of a person confirming that something they cannot afford to lose is still intact. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. And for one suspended moment, he simply stood close to me, not touching, not speaking. Close enough that I could feel the contained energy coming off him, the particular tension of a man holding a great deal of something very tightly. "I'm fine," I said. "I know," he said, and pulled me against him. It was the first time. We had been careful with each other in physical ways, moving close and retreating, the slow gravitational negotiation of two people who understood that contact would mean something, and had been treating that meaning with appropriate weight. His arms around me now felt nothing like a negotiation. They felt like a conclusion, like something that had been building toward this specific arrangement of space for months. I pressed my face against his shoulder. He was warm. He smelled like cedar and that underlying darkness, and beneath the professional stillness of him, I could feel his heart beating faster than his expression ever would have shown. "I'm sorry," he said, into the top of my head. "This happened because of me, because I didn't resolve Hale's interference completely enough, quickly enough, because I let it get close to you, Dante." "No." His arms tightened. Not painfully. The instinctive tightening of someone refusing the alternative. "Listen to me. I have been careful my entire adult life about what I allow myself to want, because wanting things creates exposure. People find what you want, and they use it." I felt him exhale. I knew, when I started coming to that restaurant every Friday, what I was risking. I came anyway. That's my responsibility, not yours. I pulled back enough to look at him. His jaw was set. His eyes were dark and serious, and carrying something that looked, at this proximity, very much like the particular anguish of a person who loves something and has only just fully understood what that makes them vulnerable to. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now I finish it," he said simply. "Richard Hale made a choice when he put your name in his mouth. That choice has consequences. I don't want anyone hurt because of me. Claire," he lifted one hand and pressed it carefully against the side of my face, thumb at my cheekbone, with the focused tenderness of someone handling something irreplaceable. "This has nothing to do with you as cause. You are not responsible for the actions of men who use innocent people as instruments." His eyes held mine. "But I will not allow anyone to threaten what is mine. I need you to understand that. Not as warning, as truth. What is mine?" Said with that same directness that had undone me every time, not possessiveness as diminishment, but as declaration. The way a person says mine about something they would rearrange everything to keep safe. "I understand," I said. His thumb moved slightly against my cheekbone. "I need to ask you something. Ask. When this is over, and it will be over, I want you to move. Not far. A building I own on Meridian Street, the top floor. It's secure. Leon would be nearby." He paused. "I'm not asking you to give up your life. I'm asking to make sure your life has better walls around it." I thought about my apartment with its broken boiler history and its secondhand furniture and the ceramic dish that had held his card since the night I'd decided not to call and then spent 5 days reconsidering. I thought about what it would mean to move toward him more completely, to let the rearrangement become official, acknowledged, visible. "Are you asking me to move closer to you?" I said. "Or are you asking because you can't stop yourself?" The honesty of that landed. He looked at me with something that broke briefly across his composed surface like light through a shutter. "Both," he said. "Is that enough of an answer?" "It's a very honest one," I said. "I've been practicing," he said, and the almost smile appeared, and for the first time it completed itself. Actually arrived, warm and real and briefly, completely unguarded. I reached up and covered his hand with mine where it rested against my face. "Yes," I said. "I'll move." Richard Hale was arrested 11 days later. I didn't ask for the details, and Dante offered only what was necessary. Hale had been under federal investigation for financial crimes predating his conflict with Dante by several years. Certain documentation had been made available to the relevant authorities through channels that Dante described, with characteristic economy, as appropriate. Victor Hale had left the city. The gray sedans stopped appearing. Dante explained it over dinner at the restaurant with no sign on the door. Our table by now. Because we had a table. Because we had accumulated enough shared geography to have things that were ours. He spoke quietly and watched my face as he spoke, gauging what I needed to hear and what could stay in the part of his world that would always be separate from me. I had made peace with that separation. Not easily. Not all at once. In the incremental way that you make peace with complicated things. By deciding that what you have access to is worth more than what you don't. He gave me honesty within the boundaries of what he could give. He gave me his attention with a completeness that I understood was rare. He gave me Tuesday mornings back, but now Leon sat 2 tables away, and the cafe owner, without a word of explanation from anyone, had started leaving a reserved sign on my window seat. Small acts. The language of a man who expressed care through the careful arrangement of the world around someone he wanted, kept whole. I moved to Meridian Street on a Saturday in December. The apartment was too large for my furniture, which looked like objects from a previous life arranged in a space that expected something more. Dante arrived in the afternoon with Leon and 2 other men I'd come to recognize by sight, and they moved boxes with a thoroughness that suggested this was not the first time they had relocated something important. At one point I found Dante in the kitchen, holding the ceramic dish from my old counter. The spare change, the forgotten receipts, the card with the silver number that I had never thrown away. He turned it in his hands, looked up at me. "You kept it," he said. "I kept it," I confirmed. He set it on the new counter carefully, in the spot near the window where the afternoon light fell. He looked at it there for a moment, with an expression I had learned by then to read. The rare, unguarded one. The one that meant something had gotten past the careful architecture of his composure and reached whatever lived beneath it. He turned to me. And without any of the patience or the careful distance or the measured steps of the months behind us, he crossed the kitchen and kissed me, with the focused, certain quality of a man who has decided to stop being careful about something and is committing to that decision completely. I kissed him back. Outside the window, December light fell clean and cold across the city. When we finally separated, his forehead rested against mine, both his hands framing my face in that careful way he had, like something irreplaceable, like something he intended to keep. "If you ever do something that reckless again," he said quietly, like answering an unknown number alone. "I called you immediately," I pointed out. "After." His eyes were dark and serious, but the warmth in them now was something I knew. Something I recognized as mine specifically. "Next time you call me first. Next time there won't be a Richard Hale," I said. "No," he agreed. "There won't." A pause. "But call me first anyway." I laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere genuinely light, and felt his hands tighten fractionally against my face at the sound of it. The instinctive response of someone who has found something they intend to protect. "Okay," I said. "I'll call you first." He pressed a kiss to my forehead, held it there a moment. Outside, the city continued in its usual rhythms. Indifferent, relentless, ordinary in all the ways that cities are ordinary. But inside the kitchen, with its too large space and its second-hand furniture and the ceramic dish catching December light on the windowsill, something had finished becoming what it had always been moving toward. Not a fairy tale. Not a rescue. Something more honest than either of those things. The specific, complicated, entirely improbable arrangement of 2 people who had found each other in the amber light of a restaurant and had, against every reasonable expectation, decided to stay. The ceramic dish gleamed on the counter. The card inside it, with its silver number I'd never needed to photograph again, had long since become something else entirely. Not a question, not a decision, but a beginning. I was grateful,